Hey everyone, Richard from Digital Foundry here, and we are returning to Fortnite on mobile this time because, well, interesting things happening here. The new wave of iOS devices have increased power that enables Fortnite to run at 60 frames per second, which is what you're seeing here. This is double the frame rate of the iPhone 10. So yeah, how did they do that? I've been talking to Epic about this, and there's a fascinating story here, not just about the capabilities of the new iPhone, but also mobile development in general. And joining me to talk about it, John Linneman.
Hey Rich, how's it going?
Yeah, not too bad. So Fortnite, iPhone, 60 frames per second. Here it is. What do you think?
Well, yeah, it's pretty impressive to see this on a phone, I have to admit. We're kind of reaching this point where it feels like the phones are in some ways catching up to what you would expect on at least a lower end console platform like the Switch. Though technically, I guess the iPhone XR, XS, whatever, are actually more powerful than the Switch in many ways, but are limited by other factors, which I think we'll discuss momentarily.
Yeah, it's a fascinating development. So I've been speaking to Epic about this because, well, you have the iPhone 10,
Yep.
and you did the Fortnite coverage for that. But the point is, according to Epic, they cap the frame rate at 30 frames per second on that phone, but theoretically, the silicon itself can run the game at 60 frames per second. Per frame render times there 8 to 16 milliseconds, which is within the window there. So yeah, this is fascinating because obviously they're holding back, and the reason they're holding back, two reasons. First of all, the phone gets too hot if you run the processor flat out. So essentially, they cap to 30 frames per second to give the phone a chance to keep cool, which is fascinating. It's an interesting example of how the considerations of developing for a mobile game are completely different than they are developing for a console.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, these phones are very slim, very light. They can't fit any sort of active cooling in there like you get with, say, the Switch, for instance. Obviously, that's one of the biggest considerations here, is it's just, a heat generation. But then also, I guess, battery life seems like a serious one to me as well. I mean, you need your phone to last. So playing a 60 FPS game like this feels like it would drop your battery life, especially on a phone with a less efficient setup like the iPhone 10 from last year.
Yeah, and it's also, of course, people put their phones in cases, which is,
Yes,
almost certainly likely to make the whole thing hotter still. So yeah, thermal management, that's one of the reasons why the iPhone 10 caps the frame rate to 30 frames per second. However, the new wave of iOS silicon, it's on TSMC's 7nm process. And essentially, this offers two advantages. First of all, the CPU and the GPU are faster than the iPhone 10, which is a given. But secondly, because it's on that new process, it runs cooler. So I'm looking at the stats here that Epic provided. So yeah, it takes 8 to 16 milliseconds per frame to render Fortnite on the iPhone 10. But on the newer phones, it drops to 8 to 10 milliseconds. So that's a big time saving, and they can use that time to, again, let the phone cool down. So yeah, it's quite fascinating here that Apple are creating this cutting edge silicon capable of so much more than you actually see in final software, but they can't afford to let the phone get too hot, so they actually have to pare back the frame rate or the visual features or whatever. And I seem to recall when you looked at Asphalt 9, you spoke to the developers about that, and they were talking about similar things.
exactly. They said that hitting 60 frames per second would have been possible at the time on the iPhone 10, but thermal issues and battery life concerns basically meant that they kind of had to cap it at 30 just to make a product that didn't blow up the consumer's phone, I guess.
Yeah, and I think also they were talking about specific types of shader that could actually cause thermal issues as well.
Yeah, that's right. I can't remember all the details on that, but yeah, it's just the considerations that you have to look at when developing a mobile title. It's really fascinating, and I have a lot of respect for the challenges that these guys are tackling head on to try to, deliver impressive looking visuals for the platform, but keeping it within those constraints.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously we have to do comparisons.
Yes.
So I started off with 10R, and here it is in spectator mode. We're spectating the same game also on the Xbox One X, and it's quite fascinating to see that both of them are now running at 60 frames per second. Even more interesting is that obviously back in the day, console versions of Fortnite were running at 30, so now we have the mobile one running at 60 as well. It really is quite remarkable. And in motion, that extra fluidity on the mobile side really does give the impression of closer parity, so it's quite a remarkable technical achievement there.
Yeah, I think when you shrink the size of the game onto a smaller phone screen, just increasing the frame rate is enough to sort of convince your eyes at least that it looks comparable.
Yeah, definitely.
And you only really notice a difference, like a really significant difference, when you put them side by side like this.
Yeah, it's funny that, because there are scenes that actually hold up really well. I mean, there is a huge resolution differential here. Obviously the X version is running dynamic 4K, and we'll talk about the resolution of the iPhone version in a bit, because it has changed since we last looked at it. But obviously resolution is a big point of difference here. But it still does an incredible job here of mimicking the far-reaching draw distances, especially when you're in the battle bus at the beginning or when you're flying about in a plane. So yeah, that's quite interesting as well. The big difference to me comes down to interiors. And it's here where you see that shadow quality, just general shading quality, ambient occlusions basically stripped back to the bare bones on mobile. And this is where the console versions just look a ton nicer. But I guess when you're outdoors and there's one primary light source, the sun, the differences aren't quite so pronounced, which is, it's quite interesting to see that.
Yeah, it is interesting. And sometimes I have to wonder if those changes, I mean, I'm sure they were made for performance reasons, but at the same time, when you're dealing with such a small screen comparatively, I feel like visibility is extremely important.
Right.
So, if more advanced shading and lighting on the interiors, making it look nicer to the eye, might actually make it a little more difficult to see what's going on that small screen. Just a theory. I have no idea if that's actually the case or not, but yeah, I mean, when you put it side by side, visually speaking, the other version, the console version, I guess in this case Xbox One X, looks a lot nicer overall.
Definitely. I mean, there are a lot of differences. If you stop and look, the water rendering vastly improved on the Xbox.
Oh yeah.
Foliage is richer and it's animated. The skybox looks a ton better. You get GPU particles on the Xbox, which are used quite liberally, and they look great. More light sources as well. The kind of glow underneath weapons and whatnot isn't visible at all on the mobile side.
Yeah, and I actually think that the mobile version looks its best when you first start the match and you're in the battle bus there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like the overarching view of the whole island. That's really convincing.
That's really impressive, isn't it? Yeah, that's the kind of killer shot for the mobile one. They actually, I seem to recall, they put a lot of effort into switching out 3D objects into 2D objects at range. They call it the imposter system.
Yeah.
And it really does a fantastic job. And yeah, when you look at it side by side, it really is quite impressive. But yes, I think to get back to the topic in hand, there's the idea that both of them now are running at 60 frames per second, and I guess we should talk a little bit about performance here on the iOS version, because it isn't quite as solid as the Xbox One X version. And we can talk about the nitpicky stuff first. When you jump out of the battle bus, there's kind of like a little small glitch, and then a few drop frames as you descend, but it's a ton smoother than PUBG on consoles in this scenario. And what I did find is that there are occasional little hiccups here and there, and you don't really tend to notice it with the touch controls. It's not an issue at all. What I did find though is that areas with extended draw distance can see frame rates drop into the mid 50s, and at that point again you don't really notice something is slightly off. But I did encounter a couple of situations where I dropped down to 45 frames per second, and at this point you do start to notice, and it does feel a little bit janky, but it didn't really happen very often.
I kind of feel like Apple needs to invest in all the manufacturers actually need to look at variable refresh rate screens for phones now.
Yeah.
That would be a great thing to have.
Yeah, well, as you know, I got the Razer phone, and I can't go back to any other phone. More on that later, I guess, possibly in a different video, because I could talk for ages about why I love that phone. Anyway, yes, other things to bear in mind in terms of performance. We need to talk about the dongle. Because we get the video feed from from Fortnite here by using Apple's Lightning to digital AV dongle. Now, if you use this dongle on an older iPhone, you can literally see the frame rate drop when you're using it. You take it out and the frame rate is restored. So there's, typically I'd say that powering two displays might cause some issues, bandwidth related perhaps. So yes, there is the outside chance here that the dongle is adding on overhead, which is causing some of the performance drops here. But what I would say is that I can't see it causing drops to 45 frames per second.
Yeah, I mean, I did a lot of testing with this dongle as well on the iPhone 10, and I think we both did kind of the same test where at points where you would see issues in games, you might unplug it and take a look at the screen and just sort of gauge, all right, has it changed much? And honestly, or you run a completely solid 60 FPS game, and if you're getting smooth frame times all the way across, it's usually all right. I feel like we're past the point where it's a huge problem, but you're right. There's at least a little overhead there.
Again, obviously, Epic have a lot of overhead on hand because they don't want the phone to overheat.
And thinking of that though, looking at this, seeing this running at 60 FPS with the cut back visuals, kind of had me thinking, like, what if they took this approach over on the Switch? Like, that version looks closer to the Xbox One, PS4, whatever version, but obviously it runs at a lower quality. So yeah, I guess what you could do then is basically bring the mobile version to Switch and see if you could hit 60 FPS, and I think it would be a better experience, to be honest.
A couple of things we should point out at this point. In fact, let's bring in our Android versus iPhone comparisons. So I have on loan the new Razer Phone 2. I'm running Fortnite on it, and the Android version does not have this 60 frames per second feature. And yes, otherwise though, I mean, visually it's very, very close to the iPhone version. I've got a couple of notes here, we'll just get them out of the way pretty quickly. Some of the textures appear to be higher quality on iOS. Very rare that you see any differences, to be honest. On some occasions, view distance is better on iOS than Android. I'm not quite sure why that is the case, because otherwise it's identical. But the big difference is there's no 60 frames per second mode. Razer Phone 2, pretty much the fastest gaming phone in the Android ecosystem. So the question is, why hasn't Epic done this? Now, what we do know is that benchmark wise, the CPU in the iPhone 10 and the new silicon in the 10R that I'm using here just wipes the floor with with the Android devices. So single core performance is basically double, and it has fewer cores than the Android phones, but there's still, if you look at like the Geekbench multi core score, we're looking at 11,000 points versus 8,700. So that's a huge CPU advantage in favor of the iOS products. So yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of the Razer phone. I've been on Android for a while now, but I think from what I'm hearing from developers and from what I'm seeing with my own eyes, with when Epic rolls out 60 frames per second for Fortnite, I think iOS is still a better platform for gaming if you're on the latest devices.
Yeah, and that's kind of consistent with what I've heard from developers as well. It's just working with their APIs and the standardized hardware. It's a lot easier to push the platform further and take better advantage of the hardware than it is on the Android side right now.
Yeah, and let's go back to resolution. I sort of hinted at it earlier. The Razer phone is running at 720p. When I ran the game on an S9 Plus, it was 1480 by 720, so you got the extra pixels side by side. Here's an interesting thing though. When we looked at the iPhone 10, it was rendering at 1461 by 675, so actually lower resolution than Android. However, now, I don't know whether it's because of a patch or because we're running this on used silicon, it's now at 1612 by 745, so the resolution is actually higher than the Android equivalent now by quite some margin, which is more in line with what I'd expect, bearing in mind the relative GPU power there.
It's just cool to see how lower end devices like phones and consoles with slow CPUs and all these other thermal limitations, the way that it seems to be pushing Epic to evolve Unreal Engine. Like, they're really targeting a wide range of devices now, and you have to imagine that all these enhancements and improvements do roll back into Unreal Engine as a whole, making it a more efficient engine, even if you're targeting higher end machines. I mean, it seems like this is good for everyone. I mean, on the flip side, it also means that they're maybe not targeting high end visual features. I mean, we haven't seen a lot on... They haven't done anything with ray tracing yet, have they?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they're playing with it internally, but we haven't seen... It doesn't feel like they're moving in the direction of, say, DICE with the Frostbite engine. But at the same time, this helps a lot of game developers, I can imagine, achieve better performance with these optimizations. At least that's what I would think.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. One final thing which I found really interesting, and again, more testament, I suspect, to Apple than to Epic, is the fact that the loading times on the iPhone are immensely fast.
That's right, yeah.
So let's bring up a comparison here. When you look at loading times on the iPhone versus the Xbox One X, the iPhone wipes the floor with the Xbox. And you can see it here where we kind of move into sort of relocation mode. This is where the player is warping, or when we move to a new character when we're spectating. I believe that is the case. But you can see that there's, we're instantly jumping on the iPhone, and we're waiting around a few seconds on the Xbox. So yeah, this is fascinating.
This is kind of a nice change, because when Unreal Engine 3, I guess it was, first appeared on phones with games like Infinity Blade and many others, actually, one of my biggest complaints there was that the loading times were very long, and that kind of flies in the face of what mobile gaming should be. So just starting up one of those games, you're looking at like 1-2 minutes of just waiting and getting through the menus and stuff. It was very time consuming and really annoying. So it's great to see that we've reached the point now where it's loading so fast that it's just about the fastest version. Yeah,
it's quite funny that. I think, when you think about it, the asset set on the iPhone will be considerably lower.
Oh yeah, of course.
Obviously the Xbox One X is loading in much more stuff, texture assets primarily, and also, of course, Apple are really quite fastidious about really fast storage, and obviously the Xbox is, running a laptop hard drive, which, in terms of access speeds, isn't really in the same league. But yeah, this was kind of like a bit of the icing on the cake here when I was lining up the comparison footage. Okay, so I think we've pretty much covered Fortnite 60 frames per second here. If you have the means, I highly recommend checking it out. You do need to set the phone to 60 frames per second manually, simply because your battery life will go down significantly faster and your phone will get hotter. So by default, Epic has the game running at the same 30 frames per second as all of the other mobile versions. But if you have the horsepower, if you have those new iPhones, and indeed the new iPads, I understand, looking at conversation with Epic here, the new iPad Pro is going to be supporting it, and even the last gen iPad Pro should be getting it if it hasn't already, but it is running at higher rather than Epic settings. But yeah, I'd take the slight quality hit there for double the frame rate.
It is a little funny they call those Epic settings though, when you look at it.
Yeah. Yep, there it is. Okay, so let's round this one off then. Thanks so much for joining me on this one, John.
But of course.
Please do like and subscribe to support the kind of work we do here. Ring the bell for instant notifications whenever a new Digital Foundry video drops. Thanks so much for making it all the way to the end, if indeed you did. And yeah, just generally, thanks for watching.